Welcome, everybody, to another exciting episode of the Haunted Vermont podcast. My name is Paul Doski, and tonight, or today, depending on whenever you are listening to this, we have a very special guest where you have had to have heard of his work, from working with Joe Citro to the artwork of a documentary from Small Town Monsters and so forth. And he has done numerous other projects. This guy is like a busy monster creator, if I may say. But other than that, let's welcome onto the show. We'll get into this, but his name is Stephen Bissette. And you would know that name because of books, but in this case, as I say Steve, Steve has allowed me to call him Steve for this occasion. So, welcome, Steve.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me in.
No problem. I've been scratching my brain of people of who I could talk to for the Haunted Vermont aspect, and just try to reach out to different people. And I happened to find you thanks to Joe, and I messaged you, and here we are talking. So I definitely appreciate your time.
Okay, I'm yours. Bring it on.
All right, Steve. For those that may not know you that well, can you give us a brief description of who you are?
Sure. I was born and raised in northern Vermont. Born in Burlington. Grew up in the Duxbury, Waterbury area primarily. I'm best known in the comic book industry for the work I did collaboratively on DC Comics' Saga of the Swamp Thing back in the 1980s. I was fortunate enough to be the penciler on the comic book series when British author Alan Moore did his first work for American comic publishers, and that was on Swamp Thing. But I've had my hands in all kinds of stuff. I mean, I was first known for the work that I did in the comic book field, not just with Swamp Thing, but also with series like 1963, Tyrant. I've co-founded, published, and co-published a horror anthology series called Taboo in the late 80s, early 90s. And since then, I was a teacher at the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River, Vermont, starting in the summer of 2005 when CCS first opened its doors. And I was there until I retired from teaching back in the summer of 2020, about a year and a half ago. And since then, I've been writing. I'm an author. I've co-authored quite a number of books, fiction and nonfiction. I've most recently written a 700-page midnight movie monograph on the Canadian film David Cronenberg's The Brood that was published by Electric Dream House in the UK. I co-authored most recently a fiction collection of novellas called Studio of Screams, where I was fortunate enough to collaborate with four terrific horror novelists, Stephen Volk, Mark Morris, Tim Levin, and Christopher Golden, where we invented a British horror film studio that never existed, and Stephen, Mark, Christopher, and Tim all wrote original novellas as if they were movie novelizations of 1960s and early 70s horror films that in our parallel universe did exist but have since vanished. And I wrote the framing material, the introduction and the conclusion to the book, as well as the interstitials between the novellas. And these days I've published two monster sketchbooks last year, one called Thoughtful Creatures and one called Brooding Creatures. And I've been doing a lot of bonus features for Blu-rays, commentary tracks and bonus feature lectures and so on. And we can talk about that if you want to. And that includes a box set called The American Horror Project, Volume 2. And I did the bonus features for the Vermont-made horror film Dark August from 1976. It was shot up in Stowe, Vermont, back in 1975. I'm also happy to say that Joe Citro and I collaborated on a number of projects, and very recently, in fact, in the fall of 2020, a publisher named Erie Lights Publishing put back into print a new, slightly larger edition of the Vermont Monster Guide, which is why I'm talking to you today.
Well, not just that, Steve, but you've also collaborated with Joe on the very old edition. I think it came out in originally 2000, but we're talking like the Vermont Ghost Guide, like the little mini manual script, as I would want to call it. It's like the perfect pocket guide when you're going on a car ride, and you did that as well.
Yeah, we did that it was published in the year 2000, and that's when we were with University Press of New England, when they still existed. Unfortunately, University Press of New England went out of business about, 3 years ago or so, 4 years ago. And so that edition of the Vermont Ghost Guide is out of print, but Joe collaborated with another great Vermont cartoonist and illustrator, Robert Waldo Brunel Jr., and they put together a new revised, larger edition of the Vermont Ghost Guide, which folks can easily pick up online.
That's right. And I actually have both editions, Steve. So I have the original and the updated version. And I actually still need to get my hands on the updated Vermont Monster Guide, but I have the original book.
We're really proud of that book. I mean, we're very proud. We were very happy with and proud of the Vermont Ghost Guide, but the Vermont Monster Guide was exactly the book that Joe and I wanted to do, and it was inspired by Joe's a little older than me, but we're of the same generation. It was inspired by the kind of books that began to pop up in paperback in the early 60s, and there was one book by, let me think now, Paul, I think the author's name was C.B. Colby, the initials C period B period, and last name is Colby, and it was a book called Strangely Enough, and both Joe and I had that book when we were kids, and the edition that I've got in my library is the one that I bought from the Scholastic Book Club when I was a kid, in junior high, and it was this wonderful collection of short, weird tales with illustrations. Not every story was illustrated, but many of them were. And that was like our role model for the Vermont Monster Guide. We wanted to do a book like Strangely Enough, but we deliberately designed it for all ages, and that's part of why I went all out with the illustration work that I did for that book. And we were also lucky in that the editor and the production department at University Press of New England at that time totally got the project, and they understood that, with the cover art, we were trying to emulate the look and feel of an old 1950s pre-code horror comic book, with the three circles, with the portraits of some of the monsters that are inside. And we also had the benefit of collaborating with my friend and fellow artist, Cayetano Garza Jr., who goes by the nickname Cat. And Cat did all the digital work and coloring on the covers, front and back. And he also repeated that feat for the new edition from Erie Lights Publishing.
Wow, that's crazy stuff. And I believe I just found the book that you're talking about, Strangely Enough. I just don't know what cover you're known for.
Yeah, the one. In fact, when we're done talking, I'll send you the link of the one. The one that I owned was from the SBS Book Club, Scholastic Book Services, and it had a weird painted cover with it's a nighttime scene with a tree in the foreground and this little scraggly figure running away, toward the distance.
That's actually the one I'm staring at.
Right, yeah, it has kind of a brown-green cover scheme, as I recall, in terms of the color scheme and so on. And that's the book. And that was our role model, We were also into, Joe and I are both of the generation where when we were in the perfect age, preteen age, that's when you'd go to the local pharmacy or tobacco store or bookshop, anywhere that sold paperbacks. And there were writers like Frank Edwards and Brad Steiger who were doing kind of the first wave of paperback true weird stories. Frank Edwards was more famous for his books on UFOs and flying saucers. But both of them, Frank Edwards and Brad Steiger, were just doing... Oh, and Hans Holzer was another one of the writers, where they kind of specialized in this genre of just, weird but true stories. Collections of books of weird true ghost stories, weird true monster sightings, weird true treasure hunt stories, and stuff like that. And that was big when we were kids, And we also grew up during... the first wave of 1960s flying saucer magazines, which really were pretty prominent on the newsstand. Even mainstream magazines like Look and Life, these oversized photo news magazines that were very popular in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. In the early 60s, they would have entire special issues just on flying saucers. So all of that, was what was feeding Joe's and my scheme, if you will, for the Vermont Monster Guide.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. Like, there's information-wise there, Steve. But I mean, I can see why. Yeah, and I agree with you. This cover that you're mentioning too is like, I don't know. I like it. It's like I like it because it's like the old-fashioned book style that we don't really see anymore. It's like that very soft tainted, like weird atmosphere with, like you said, like this weird figure that's running through the woods. And I like the little slogan that's on the cover too. It's like fact or fiction, real or imagined, and it's
That's the edition. That's the very one. Yeah, my favorite story in that book. I can't speak to Joe's favorite in that book. My favorite story in that book, if I remember correctly, the title of it was The Whistle. And all the stories in the C.B. Colby book, strangely enough, are, they're short. They're like 2 pages, 3 pages at the most. They're anecdotes. And they have no attributions. They're just sort of, here's a story. And The Whistle had this really sparse illustration of like a nighttime with a little ranch house and these tall trees next to it and a moon up in the sky above. And it's the story of an old lady who lives alone out in the middle of the country. She has a pet dog. And she starts hearing this whistle sound from out in the woods. And it terrifies her because she keeps hearing it and she doesn't know what it is. She's never heard anything like it. And her dog starts barking, and she makes the mistake of opening the door to her house. And the dog goes bolting out, tears into the woods toward where the whistling sound is coming from. And she hears her dog yip, and then that's it. She doesn't hear her dog anymore, and she never hears the whistle again. And that story, that really stuck with me. I read that when I was pretty young, and it was... And as I say, there's no attribution in the Colby books. He doesn't even say what state or, what country a lot of these things supposedly took place in, which kind of made some of them, like that story about the whistling, even more haunting because you thought, wow, this could happen anywhere, Maybe it happened in my town.
So, and touch on that is, those are like the best stories, right, Steve? Because then it gets your imagination going and everything, just like you're saying, like, wow, did this could this happen around here? Like, oh man.
Exactly, yeah.
And those are the best. And to really get going too on this is like, so how did you and Joe talk with one another to determine what type of cryptids should be brought into the Vermont Monster Guide anyway?
Well, that was really up to Joe. When I worked with Joe, I also illustrated, I think the first project I did with Joe was I illustrated the hardcover limited edition of his novel Deus Ex, which is one of Joe's fiction novels. And it's my favorite in a lot of ways of his fiction novels, not just because I got to work from it, but also it's just a really strong piece of writing. And So we would usually work, with kind of a loosey-goosey back and forth. Joe would put together a list of the stories that he had in mind, and I have to admit, and I don't think I'm talking out of class here, when we first thought about doing the book, I remember Joe saying at one point he didn't know if there were enough stories. And as it turned out, not only were there plenty of stories, but they kept presenting themselves even as we delivered the final manuscript. In fact, at the beginning of the Vermont Monster Guide, there's a page right at the start. It's either before or just after the title page, where we did a kind of comic format story about this woman who had seen a satyr, a goat-like man, a pan figure. And that story came in so late that there wasn't time for Joe to fold it into the manuscript because all the typesetting had been done and proofed. So I hand-lettered it, and we presented that as a standalone. But it turned out there were plenty of cryptid and monster stories. As with the Vermont Ghost Guide, and I cannot tell you which one it is, we did make up one story. In both books, there is one story that is completely fabricated. And I'm not referring to something like the Goonyak, which is one of the stories in the Vermont Monster Guide that turned out to be a hoax, and Joe, spells that out in the text piece. But to answer your question, Joe would prepare a list, and I started doing sketches, and we just sort of organically, pulled the whole thing together. I worked in a loose brush, pen, and ink style that I'm most comfortable with, in part because being a monster book, that's really my meat and potatoes. Drawing monsters is what I love most in the world, next to my wife and my family. And so, so once we settled on which cryptids and which creatures we were going to be including, it usually went from rough drawing to final. I think there were only a couple of stories where Joe had visual reference. He did have visual reference from the eyewitnesses that he got the stories from for the long-leggedy cats. And I also remember working from a little color drawing that was done like with Crayola crayons of the giant caterpillar. Not giant like 40 feet tall, but, a big caterpillar as big as your foreleg. Unusually large caterpillar. And I do remember working from a color photocopy or an original drawing that Joe had. In other cases, some of the source materials, Paul, were postcards. Like Joe had found a postcard of the boy-headed calf. And it was this horrible taxidermy specimen. The hard part was making it, look like a living creature when I drew it. And in one or two cases, Joe had old woodcut illustrations. I remember Joe showing me a woodcut or steel engraving illustration of old slippery skins. And I remember Joe turning up a cartoon line drawing illustration of the Lake Menfremagog monster. And I believe we included that drawing in the book itself, the original, period drawing from the early 1900s. And then we also turned up a line-drawn illustration from, I could be wrong, I think it was Harper's Magazine, and it was a line drawing of Champ that Joe had found in archives or somewhere. And then later I found the original copy of Harper's Weekly or a magazine, and it turned out the illustration was actually of a constructed lake monster that a group of students had built and put out on Lake Champlain. And of course, the magazine illustrator had used a little imaginative finesse to make it look like a living lake monster. But most of the stuff, I was working from the verbal descriptions that Joe had gathered.
and that is cool. I like that's so fascinating as well. Like I like that. Like you must have been around when I believe it was the Rutland Herald. I forget. Oh man, this is I should have like tried to find this image. My dad kept it, and because it was a newspaper article, and it was the uh an image of this couple, if I remember the article correctly. They took this picture when they were out in the woods somewhere in Rutland, and I want to say it was like 1978, and maybe around August. That within the picture that you could kind of see because newspapers had changed so much as the generation went on, where now you got colored photos where back then it was black and white. So in this case, they were trying to say inside of the photo that they took is a very large creature, what they called a Vermont Bigfoot, which I don't know if you saw that one at all.
No, that doesn't. Well, Joe had photos he showed me associated with regional Sasquatch or Bigfoot type creature sightings. But I usually when I would see a photo Joe had, it was a clipping he had from some other source, and I wasn't aware what the original sources were. So I may have seen that photo as one of the images that Joe had in his files, but who knows? I know that there were at least 4 or 5 photos that Joe showed me. Some of them were, objects you would see in any walk in the forest, an odd-shaped rotted tree. And the photo wasn't trying to misrepresent it. Joe just had images of, creature-like things that have been seen in the woods, including rocks and rotted trees and so on. But I do recall a couple. I may have seen that photo you're describing. 1978 is not that long ago to me. I mean, I was I was what 23 in 1973. So that's not a distant, faraway time for me. But I understand, how those things appear in the year 2022, particularly for people who were born after 1978. That's like, whoa, long time ago. So,
oh yeah,
my God,
yeah.
that's before there were video stores in Vermont. What are video stores?
and that's the sad thing. I actually miss like my video stores. Like, I know you said you're familiar with Rutland, but I remember like Video World. I remember Blockbuster, and
I knew a lot of those people. I was a shareholder in First Run Video, which was the first superstore in southern Vermont. First Run Video was based in Brattleboro. I was a shareholder starting in 1991, and then I was co-manager and buyer at First Run Video from 1998 until 2005. And I was part of the New England Buying Group, which was this collective of New England video store owners. And so I got to meet a lot of the people who ran the video stores all around Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And so I knew a couple of those folks whose businesses you're missing right now. I think it's also important to mention for your listeners that to most of the rest of the world, Rutland, Vermont is like this strange, faraway, exotic place. One of the stories in the Vermont Monster Guide is the story involving these human-faced bats that were reported in the World Weekly News, which was one of those tabloid, lurid tabloid newspapers that used to be sold right at the front kiosk by the checkout counter at grocery stores everywhere. And the World Weekly News, before they introduced the Bat Boy, which is what most people associate with the World Weekly News, before they had the first Bat Boy story, they ran a story involving human-faced bats that they said had been found in a cave in Rutland, Vermont. Now, to most World Weekly News readers in North America, Rutland, Vermont sounds, whoa, where's that, It's like some remote, faraway location, and whoever the reporter and editors were at that time, Rutland sound like, okay, nobody's going to check this story, right? And it's very funny to me that when they when they had a sequel story to that, which moved them closer to the Bat Boy, the next discovery of human-faced bats, probably because somebody wrote or called them on it, they were no longer in Rutland. They were now in China, China's even more exotic than Rutland, Vermont, so.
Whoa! And real quick there, Steve, I want to go back and recorrect the date that I'm trying to think of the newspaper. I actually just found the screen copy that I did of the newspaper before I put it back into the book that my dad used to own. And so this newspaper actually came on from the Rutland Herald, actually, and it was Friday morning, the April 25th at 1985, actually. So,
1985. There we go.
Yeah, so August of 1978, I think is what I said, is completely wrong. So I must have been thinking of something else.
Well, 1985 is still long ago to a lot of the folks listening to our conversation right now. So, to me, it's when my son was born. That's when we had our second kid in 1985, and I was working on Swamp Thing at that time. I have since met people who absolutely swear that they saw Sasquatch or Sasquatch themselves in that part of the state over Route 7 route, including Rutland and so on. So and they were credible witnesses. I mean, these are people older than myself. They were parents of friends of mine. Actually, it was one of my coworkers at First Run Video whose parents at a barbecue mentioned that they had seen this thing. And they weren't spinning a yarn. This was something they had seen, and it just kind of came up in conversation after everyone had eaten. And I never forgot that. And they said they saw it somewhere over on that western stretch of the state, not far from where you are.
Oh, wow. Yeah. One of the sites that I usually go check out, because it usually gets updated pretty much almost every week, if not every month, which is the bfro.net, which is, for people listening that don't know, Bigfoot field research organization, where you can submit a report that you've seen possibly a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot, and somebody from the BFRO will come and investigate and will talk to you and take pictures and then put a report onto the site, so that way they're documenting all the sightings and everything. And which is interesting because apparently for us, Steve, the last supposedly last time somebody witnessed a Bigfoot sighting here in Vermont was actually in 2019. It was actually around, I believe, your area.
Anything's possible. I believe anything being possible, especially in New England. We're finding out more and more. Vermont Fish and Game, for instance, Vermont Fish and Game and our nearby state Fish and Game still absolutely maintain there have been no catamounts, evidence of catamount. But they did concede more recently that we are in migration patterns of a certain species of mountain lion. It is not the catamount per se. That species apparently has long been extinct. But now for outfits like the New Hampshire and Vermont Fish and Game departments to concede that there is evidence for migration patterns cutting through our parts of the state involving mountain lions, that lends a lot of credibility to the witnesses who have maintained over the years, including Joe Citro, that they had seen, large, long-tailed wild cats here in the state of Vermont. So who knows? Anything's possible. My fascination these days has been with, I don't have to buy into whether there are actually Bigfoot, for instance, to feed my passions. Lately, I've been spending, about 6 years now, researching what I call cryptid cinema, and I'm fascinated by films, fiction films, and documentaries that involve all forms of cryptids. Lake monsters, Bigfoot, unidentifiable animals. And I'm happy to report to you, it's not Vermont, but it is Massachusetts, that one of the lost Bigfoot movies from the 1970s, it was shot down in Massachusetts. And it was actually released theatrically. I have found newspaper clippings for it. And last year I actually found online and purchased a press book for this movie. Press books are what were sent to movie theaters when they were going to show, when they had booked a feature film to show in the theater. They would get a press book beforehand that would have all the ad slicks and promotional, articles and so on for the film that was going to be showing at their theater. And it's a movie called Sasquatch, Sasqua. And that's the closest I know of to Vermont of a Bigfoot movie being made in proximity of our home state.
Huh. I'm gonna have to try to find that now. So
it's not out there. There's materials out there of artifacts of the movie's brief theatrical life, and I have been told by one cryptozoologist that there are rumors of a Blu-ray label, trying to move us toward finally some sort of home video release of this film. But up until now, it's been like a lost movie. It's kind of amazing. Again, the 1970s seems far away for anyone born after 1980. But for me, that's a recent memory, and I'm always stunned when I find out about a lost movie, a movie that you just can't see now, that was playing in drive-ins back when I was in my 20s. Another lost Bigfoot film, this has nothing to do with New England, but there's another lost Bigfoot film called Revenge of Bigfoot, which actually had a Hollywood star in it, Rory Calhoun. That film is lost as well. There's no available prints. It doesn't seem to exist in any film library. It's never been released, legally or illegally on any form of home video platform. But stranger things have happened. These films may yet turn up. I only mentioned Sasquatch to you, Paul, because there is a New England angle to it, and I love that. That somebody in northern Massachusetts made a Bigfoot movie with local actors. I guess from reading the press book, the plot was basically hippies versus Bigfoot.
Oh, that already sounds like a fun movie.
Exactly. It makes you instantly want to see it.
Exactly.
It had a great poster too. It was like this weird, scraggly, drawing of a Bigfoot running toward you. It's in a running position. So anyway, that's one of my fascinations now. I did get the first volume of a book series out via Amazon. It's called Cryptid Cinema, and you can find it under my name, Stephen R. Bissette. My good friend Tim Paxton did all the design work on the book. And we're working right now on the second volume, which is an entire book just about the making of The Legend of Boggy Creek from 1972, the first really successful Bigfoot movie. It's the movie that really busted the genre wide open. There were a couple Bigfoot films made before that, but it was Legend of Boggy Creek that really caught fire at the box office and popularized, that as a genre in and of itself. So that's also the kind of work I'm into too.
Nice. And I'm going to touch on that movie that you just mentioned, actually. Sasquatch.
Sasquatch, yeah.
Sasqua. I actually just found it on IMDb, where I'm looking at the poster right now. If you want to,
it's cool, isn't it? It's cool.
It really is. I like that.
And I've since seen that poster graphic lifted for DVD releases of other Bigfoot movies. So obviously hilarious. The graphic is now out there. Once something is out on the internet, it's out there. So, but Sasquatch is lost. We've yet to see it. I hope it comes out in my lifetime, because I would love to. That's one of those lost movies I would love to see. I'm sure it's not much. I mean, I'm talking about a super low budget, regionally made film, but that's my meat and potatoes. I also put out a book as a writer and editor called Green Mountain Cinema. Shortly after Joe and I did the Vermont Ghost Guide back in 2000, during the next election cycle, I put out a one-shot book called Green Mountain Cinema. And that's one of my hobbies as well, is trying to piece together a coherent history of Vermont films and filmmaking. And also films about Vermont, because there are more films that are set in fictional Vermont than there are movies actually made in Vermont.
Well, that's interesting. And to touch on again that movie, Sasquatch, I'm just going to read a couple things real quick for the people listening as well. So the plot of Sasquatch is a bunch of hippies move into an abandoned farmhouse out in the woods in New England. Deputy Richard is always hassling them. And of course, when the bloody Bigfoot murders start, the hippies are blamed. And down below, I'm seeing that the budget of this film was supposedly around $185,000, and the release date was August 17th, 1975.
Yep, that's it. That's the one. And it actually played not just in Massachusetts. I have found clippings for it playing in the southern states as well. You know, it did get out there. It didn't play wide, but it did get out there. And now that so many regional newspaper archives are online, anybody who's interested in digging, you know, you can find evidence of oddball films like Sasquatch where they popped up, you know, where they played.
That's awesome. And speaking of the other film that you were mentioning, Revenge of Bigfoot, I just found that one too. And that poster art looks really cool too.
Yeah, that has terrific poster art, and that film actually played fairly wide. That's another 1970s, mid 1970s film, and it played fairly wide, which makes it even odder that it has disappeared. But people have to remember, you know, where there isn't a corporate stewardship, when you're not talking about a large studio or a media corporation, you know, caring for and maintaining the negatives and interpositives and prints of a film, you know, a film like Sasquatch, they could probably afford one, maybe two prints of that movie to put out there for theaters, so it got very little play. And a film like Revenge of Bigfoot, even though it played wide the year it came out, it disappeared so quickly. That indicates that there, again, were probably just very, very few prints made. And if there were any original materials that survived, a negative, an interpositive, those are what you need to make another print of a film. They're probably in the hands of a private owner, a private proprietor of the film. And because it was an independent film, Paul, you know, there is no surviving company that owns that stuff. When one of the daughters of Charles B. Pierce, her name is Pamela Barcelo, decided to try to rescue and restore her daddy's movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek, it turned out that all the original materials, the negatives, the copyright, the prints, they were in the receivership, they were in the ownership of a trucking company in Arkansas, Texas area, because the original backers of the film, the people that put up the money for Legend of Boggy Creek, their business wasn't film, their business was trucking. So you never know. You never know. So.
Yeah, and to touch on once again another great movie, or should I say documentary, The Legend of Boggy Creek. I think it was like 2-3 years ago now that they finally re-released it onto like Blu-ray. So they finally upgraded it.
That's the version that Pamela Pierce Barcelo put out. Pamela tracked down all the original materials. She tracked down and contacted the family who owned the trucking firm that had backed the film. They turned over the copyright and everything to her because according to Pamela, you know, they thought, well, this is what your father would have wanted. And she worked with, Eastman House in Rochester, New York. They did a professional restoration of the original Technicolor Technoscope elements of the film, and it looks and sounds better now than it ever did. And that's a film I first saw in theaters when it came out. That film came out when I was 17, 18 years old. I saw it at the Paramount Theater up in Barre, Vermont, and then I saw it again at a drive-in later that year. And, you know, now on Blu-ray, Legend of Boggy Creek, it looks and sounds as good or better than it ever looked or sounded in a theater. If you're a fan of Bigfoot movies, I cannot recommend highly enough, you know, tracking down and getting a copy of Legend of Boggy Creek. And don't balk at the price, because whatever you spend, that money, especially if you order it from her website, that money is going to the family of the people that made that film. And who better, you know, to send your $22 or $23 to, you know?
Yeah.
So I love this stuff. And I love it as much as the kind of work that Joe was doing when we were pulling together the Vermont Monster Guide. I just find all this so much fun, I can't tell you.
It already sounds like it by the way you're talking, Steve. I mean, it sounds like you've had a great time, and you still like it still feels like out of your voice, like you still find it fascinating that even after all these years, like all the new stories that you're hearing, or even people still talking about the stories that you help, you know, bring to the light, as I may say, and even with the way that you do the illustrations, like I think one of my favorites, to be honest, with the Vermont Monster Guide is I'm trying to remember the exact wording, but it's like the Moose King. I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, and that was one of the pieces that I did. Joe wanted to have, I think, 4 pieces that we did as kind of chapter headings, where I painted them in ink wash, you know, so they look like photographs. And the Moose King was one of those illustrations that I did. Joe wanted them to look like old postcards, and that's what we did. Yeah, I love the Moose King story. I also love the story about the white-tailed deer, the buck nobody could bring down, and yep. I did the drawing in the book where it's got remnants of like arrows it was shot with and stuff still sticking out of its hide. Yeah, that stuff's a lot of fun. I love drawing animals as much as I love drawing, you know, imaginary and possibly not imaginary creatures. I also love drawing animals, and it's rare that I get to work on a book project like the Monster Guide that got to indulge all those appetites, including, you know, giant rabbits, giant leeches,
giant snake. Yeah.
There was one story I gave to Joe that did make it into the book. There's a couple stories that I brought to the table, but the one that I brought to the table, completely apocryphal, was the story of the giant snapping turtle in the duck pond in Duxbury, Vermont. You know, as an adult, I have no doubt that the adults who told us about the giant snapping turtle were telling us about that just to keep us from swimming in that pond. But it didn't keep us from swimming in the pond. It did keep us from skinny dipping in the pond, because one of the adults said, yeah, snapping turtles love to nibble on things that look like little worms dangling down, so we always kept our shorts on.
That's hilarious.
But, you know, that giant snapping turtle, we never saw evidence for it, and even as kids, you're like, you know, when adults are telling you a boogeyman story just to try to get you to behave. But
exactly.
we weren't sure, so we were still careful. You know, maybe it was in there.
That's hilarious. Yeah, no, what's the other favorite one that I like? It's the stone eating the monster there.
Oh yeah, that was one of Joe's discoveries. There's a number of stories in the book that were Joe's discoveries, and that man-eating stone was one of them, and that was a fun drawing to do. You know, I was kind of pushing it over the top. As soon as you're anthropomorphizing a rock or a boulder, you know, you're kind of moving in the direction of the Return to Oz or something. But it was a fun drawing to do, to try to capture the look and feel of a big mossy boulder and give it just enough of a hint of, you know, a facial expression to communicate appetite. I also Joe was also the fellow who turned up. I mean, it was Joe that first turned up the story of the Pigman in Northfield, and I'm very honored to have been the first artist to tackle, a reconstruction of the Pigman. I ended up doing 3 or 4 versions. There's the version I did that appeared in the weird New England book that Joe Citro wrote for that line of oversized illustrated books that.
If I remember right too, that also has like 2 the whale tails on
The
the
whale tails were in it. Yeah, it was a series of books that was published. I could be wrong. I think it was one of the imprints owned by Barnes and Noble. They were publishing books to stock in their chain bookstores, and it was a line of books that were edited by the 2 guys who originated, edited, and published the magazine Weird New Jersey. And Joe was commissioned by Joe had communicated with them by mail, corresponded, and spoke to them, and they approached him to do the Weird New England volume for that oversized hardcover series. And Joe and those 2 editors asked me to do a color portrait of the Pigman, and I did it for that book. It's the same cover that later was used on the 7 Days newspaper when they did I think it was a Halloween piece on Joe, or a piece they did when the Vermont Monster Guide first came out in 2009, and when we let them use that cover illustration. We let them use that illustration as a cover. And then when we were working on the Vermont Monster Guide, both Joe and I felt that the version I had done for Weird New England was a little too aggressive, if you will. It was a little too buff. It was a little too bulky. It looked like a mean monster, something to be afraid of. And the fact of the Pigman accounts that Joe turned up is that people would see it out grubbing around in their garbage. I mean, this was not like a monster. This was like something that was, a scavenger. So I kind of stripped down my approach to it, and the version that appears in the Vermont Monster Guide is the one I'm happier with, where it kind of looks like this sad little guy, this pathetic little creature that's reduced to ferreting through people's garbage cans to try to find something to eat. And that's how it goes when you're an artist, when you're an illustrator. Sometimes you have to get certain drawings out of your system before you arrive at the drawing you're happiest with. You sort of have to work through different versions of a creature. And even if you just flip through the Vermont Monster Guide, because there's a lake meant from Agog monster and Champ, of course. I got to experiment with different approaches, even to drawing lake monsters.
Oh wow!
So.
And to touch on that too, with like as you were talking with how you were trying to do the I forget the word you're using again, the ink to make it like an old photograph there.
Oh yeah, the wash illustrations. Yeah, it's ink wash. It's gray tone wash illustration. It's a form of watercolor, but you're only working in black and white with ink washes.
Gotcha. And speaking of like book covers for a minute too, is I'm trying to figure out how to put this in words for the people listening. But your original cover for the Vermont Ghost Guide there, it featured the legendary, infamous story of Emily's Bridge that we have here. So what was that color? That almost feels like a watercolor. If I may say.
It is. I don't work digitally. I don't do digital artwork. Everything I do is by hand on paper or board or canvas. And that particular cover, that was quite a challenge to do that cover. I growing up in the Duxbury-Waterbury area, I was like, I grew up like 10 miles from Stowe. So I knew the story of Emily's Bridge growing up. In fact, I could share with you a funny anecdote about when I was a student at Johnson State College, and a bunch of us bundled into a car one night, a little too stoned and drunk to be driving a car from Johnson to Stowe and back, but we did it, and we had an encounter at Emily's Bridge. But anyway, when I was doing that cover, it is done with watercolor Dr. Martin dyes, which are these really bright, almost iridescent, translucent, transparent watercolor-based colors. They're really, really bright, and I love working with them. So that was and there's also some oil pastel and colored pencil and a little bit of brush and ink as well to make sure the interior of Emily's Bridge is really black. That was a fun cover to do. Now, one of the reasons it is set in the fall is, I'm a huckster. My dad had many professions when I was growing up. I grew up in a military family. He was in 4 different branches of the service before he retired from the military. And as I was growing up, my dad had a couple different businesses, a heating oil business called Eagle Oil out of Duxbury, and Bissette's Market, a grocery store that I grew up working in. So, I've got a huckster gene in me, if you will. So knowing, by the time we did the Vermont Ghost Guide, I had quite a number of years having worked in the comic book field and doing many, many pieces of cover art. I knew the purpose of cover art is to attract the eye and hopefully the hand of a potential buyer. As we found at the video store when I was a manager at First Run Video, 9 times out of 10, if a customer touched a video box on the new release wall, they took it home. They took that movie home with them. So book covers, video box art, DVD box art, record cover art, and now CD cover art. Whether you're looking at it in a real brick-and-mortar retail establishment or you're looking at it online, a cover has an important purpose. It's to catch your eye and to make you want to look at the object. It makes you want to look at the book. And I knew that, what does Vermont mean to most people? It means fall foliage. So I was going to have to draw Emily's Bridge during autumn because I wanted to have the bright colors of fall foliage dominating that color scheme. What's the least scary colors out there? Well, red and yellow. They're not scary. I mean, even though they're the color of a yield sign and a stop sign, and we should be concerned when we're driving that we see red or yellow, those are cheerful colors. They're warm colors, even hot colors in the case of yellow and red together. So I had to arrive at a color scheme where the ghostly figure of Emily on the bridge was going to involve the opposite complementary colors, so blues and purples. That's how I was going to paint Emily on the bridge. And, I joked at the time, the only way I could have made that cover more Vermonty is if I put a Holstein cow and a wedge of cheddar cheese somewhere in the picture, But a covered bridge, fall foliage, that says Vermont. That image says Vermont to people. So to stick a spooky little spectral figure of Emily in the bridge, to me, was like a perfect cover image. And of course, Emily's Bridge is one of the stories that Joe Citro and other Vermont folklorists are probably most asked about. That I have no doubt that that's probably the most world famous next to Champ of our Vermont weirdos, if you will. The challenge of doing that painting is because I was not doing it digitally. The entire work that I did on that painting, the final piece of the painting was Emily's figure inside the darkness of the bridge. Mm-hmm. And here, the artists that are listening will get this. One of the hardest media to work with is watercolor because you can't control them, right? You sort of have to get, and it takes years and years to build the skill, you get skilled in orchestrating happy accidents, right? Because the color, particularly when you're working with a water-saturated paper, you can lay down a color next to another color, but you don't know really what they're going to do when they bleed into each other. They might just turn to mud, So that entire cover painting, and it's oversized, it's much larger than how it appears on the book. You always work larger and then reduce it down for publishing. The entire cover composition could have ended up in the trash can if I didn't get Emily right.
Oh, no.
And if you look at that cover, if you have it in front of you, Paul, her hair is what kind of bleeds off into the darkness. It's the one part of her figure that really says ghost, right, is the way her hair spreads. And all of that was done by trying to orchestrate the manipulation of opaque white into a pool of light blue water and bleeding the black ink around it into that pool of water. And I had a hairdryer right at hand so that the second that they blended the way I was hoping they would blend, I could hit it with the hot air from the hairdryer and dry it as quickly as possible on the paper. And it worked. I was lucky that I didn't screw up the painting. It actually worked. I didn't have to redo it. So I'm really proud of that cover. I still think it's a striking image, and it obviously worked on the book. I mean, that book went into multiple printings. That book stayed in print from University Press of New England from 2000 until they closed their doors. That book stayed in print. They kept reprinting it, and that was not the case with the Vermont Monster Guide. For whatever reason, even though I think the Vermont Monster Guide is a great book and has a really nice cover, and that cover concept was Joe Citro's concept with the question mark shape of Champ's neck over the bottom of the question mark being the reflection of the moon in Lake Champlain's waters, it just didn't catch on the way the Vermont Ghost Guide did. And the Ghost Guide had a long, healthy life. I mean, well over a decade, almost a decade and a half. So.
Yeah, and to touch on the Vermont Monster Guide book cover for a minute there, Steve, is there are two different type of cover, just for people listening too, is like the original had not only the same exact Champ that you're talking about, but onto the left side you have like almost like the old comic style where you have
it's the style of the old EC comics, like Tales from the Crypt. Yep. The Haunt of Fear, the Vault of Horror. Yeah, we were deliberately emulating the look and feel of the old 1950s, and that's the cover of the original edition from University Press of New England. The current edition, the one that's out from Erie Lights Publishing, has a more of a blue and silver color scheme, and the three circles are gone. It's just the image of Champ and the kind of question mark configuration. Again, all that color work, even on the new version, was done by Cat Garza. He is just a terrific artist. The one thing I kind of had to, and Cat stuck to this for both covers, when he was originally doing the color for Champ, he was going to make it, what's the color most artists make lake monsters?
Green?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. And I was like, no. I want it to say Vermont. I want it to have the pattern of a brook trout or a rainbow trout. Like I grew up fishing, and one of the things that says to me, freshwater life form, is that very distinctive coloration that, and it's two different species. They have different color patterns, but there's a certain look to trout. And that's what I wanted our Champ to have was, let's modify the skin patterns of a trout, a freshwater trout, because trout is one of the fish I most associate with fishing in Vermont. And Cat got it. Once I said it to him and he did some looking at skin patterns of trout, he went, I got it. And he perfectly realized it. I'm very happy with that aspect of both the covers.
Yeah, I like both versions, but I definitely have to say I think the original cover better just because of the whole EC comic style type thing. Like, I just love that old stuff. Like, we don't really see too much of that nowadays. I mean, I know Joe and Robert brought that back with the updated Vermont Ghost Guide, which I thought was awesome.
Yeah,
I just wish you could see more of that, just because it's kind of like poison to the eye, if you know what I mean. Just because.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I totally love it, and I'm a horror comics junkie. I mean, I'm the guy. I was one of the artists on Swamp Thing when we lost the Comics Code Authority in 1984. So I love that association with the pre-code horror comics that we brought to the original version of the Vermont Monster Guide. When you work with publishers, different publishers have different aesthetics. They have different palettes. They have different concerns. And for whatever reason, when Erie Lights, Joe is the one who put together the arrangement with Erie Lights Publishing. Very satisfactory arrangement, I have to say. They've taken good care of us. And But when they took on the book, they wanted to alter the cover scheme, and for whatever reason, that's what they wanted to go with. I was glad that they kept the lettering design. The Vermont Monster in the title lettering on the cover to the Vermont Monster Guide is patterned on the lettering pattern of the old famous Monsters of Filmland Monster magazine from the 60s, late 50s and 60s and early 70s. So I'm glad they retained that. Yeah, I like both covers a lot. They both have a very different flavor. I don't know if the iconography of old pre-code comics speaks to a contemporary audience. That may have been one of the factors in the folks at Erie Lights deciding to eliminate that part of the cover. Or it may just be, a lot of times a new publisher comes in and they don't want to just repeat the branding of a prior publisher. They want it to have a fresh look. So, anyway, I'm glad you dig the first version because I really love that too. But hey,
yeah, and I agree with what you're saying too. And I'm actually kind of surprised that they didn't want either you or somebody to really kind of create a new book cover for the updated version. To be honest,
well, I have to say a lot of publishers these days. I mean, there were a number of factors in that, some of which I just wasn't privy to. A lot of book publishers these days, particularly with print on demand and with online venues, the last book cover I did, the last original book cover I did, there was no pay for that cover art. And the publisher said, "Oh, we don't pay cover artists." A lot of publishers these days just use generic cover art, or they'll pull some public domain image and adapt it. The art of cover art for books has really gone through a number of upheavals over the last 2 decades, and on my end of the equation, being an artist, we really feel it. I get approached more often. I just did original cover art for a Blu-ray release in Britain of a Jersey Devil film called The Last Broadcast from 1998, and for that cover, they not only offered a very fair pay rate, but they wanted a very painterly looking cover. They wanted something specific, and it was fun working with them because here's a Blu-ray label, 101 out of the UK, and they were paying closer attention to their cover design than I've had any book publisher even begin to talk to me about covers in the last 5-6 years. That said, I just this week signed with Abrams Books on a new project I'm going to be working on for the next 2.5 years. And the first thing I've got to turn in this spring, early summer, are the cover designs. So I'm looking forward to engaging with Abrams Books on this book project, in part because they do still care about how the books look and how the covers look. That does not mean a publisher like Erie Lights doesn't care. They did care a great deal. And I wanted to make sure that they worked with Kat Garza. So whatever payment there was for the cover went to Kat. And they decided to work with a variation on the original cover. When you're reprinting a book, if there are components of that book that are perceived as still market valuable, still having some box office value, you want to retain those. So I'm proud that Erie Lights wanted to keep the basic cover design of the original Monster Guide, the Portrait of Champ. But again, I'm not privy to what the internal decisions were. Kat Garza would know more what that conversation was in terms of arriving at the final draft of the front and back covers.
Yeah. Well, I think they kept it too because Champ had become really the next like big Vermont monster too. And not only that, but I know like across the lake, if if I may say, is you're going to be in New York, and then you got what they call Champ Day that they celebrate there, and I think we sort of do something like that over here. But I know every year like Champ Day is always celebrated over there in
You know,
New York.
Champ is world famous, you know. I mean, Japanese film crews have come to Lake Champlain to cover Champ. I mean, Champ now is, I don't think we're in any competition with Nessie. You know, the Loch Ness Monster is still, without a doubt, in the English-speaking world, the best known of all lake or loch monsters. But Champ is up there these days, you know. Champ has really become very well known, in part because of that photograph that popped up back in the 80s, you know, of Champ. And so Champ is really well known. And yeah, Champ was, how could you do a book called The Vermont Monster Guide and not have Champ on the cover? Like
Exactly.
That, you know, and it's kind of a no-brainer the same way that, you know, the Vermont Ghost Guide, when Joe and I were putting it together back in the year 2000, well, of course Emily's Bridge was going to be the cover image for the Vermont Ghost Guide. So
yeah, because that was the most talked about.
Back then, it made sense, you know.
Yeah, so. Exactly. And to continue the Champ talk for a minute, too, Steve, you also did the poster and I want to say the DVD artwork for the Small Town Monsters project on the Trail of Champ. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Like,
oh yeah, that was great fun. The way that came together is Joe and I were invited to participate in the International Cryptozoology Museum's annual cryptozoology convention. There's an annual event that they do up in the Portland, Maine area. And yeah. Joe and I got invited up. I think we went 2 years in a row. And the second appearance that I made up there, I met Seth Breedlove and his creative partners in Small Town Monsters. And at that time, they had put out, I think when I met them, they had 4 documentaries out. They had done 4 documentaries in all at that time. Now they've done, you know, a whole bevy of them. I highly recommend to any interested listeners any and all of the Small Town Monsters documentaries, and those are available on disc. You can get them at their website, or you can watch them via various streaming services these days. And I liked Seth a lot. I mean, when I met he and his wife, I really liked them as people, and we had a lot of things in common. And I really respected the work they did. Having, you know, when I was working on the book Cryptid Cinema, I watched every, you know, TV show, documentary I could find on the subject matter of cryptids. And there's a lot of interesting ones out there, but there were 2 filmmakers in particular I was attracted to because of their work. One of them was a filmmaker named Seth Breedlove, and I really liked the Small Town Monsters documentaries I'd seen, and to then find myself sitting at a table across from Seth and his partners at this cryptozoology event was just like amazing, you know. And by the end of that convention, Seth and his partners approached me and they said, you know, we're going to be doing this new series called On the Trail of, and we're launching it with a documentary on Champ. Would you be willing to do the cover art? And I said, sure. Now, I didn't want to just repeat, you know, the same kind of image that Joe and I had put together for the Vermont Monster Guide. And as I mentioned earlier, the design of the Vermont Monster Guide is really Joe Citro's concept. So I wanted to do something different from that. And I really love the original poster art done by the artist Ralph McQuarrie, whose work is best known to most Americans, if they're aware of him at all, because he was the conceptual artist for Star Wars, the original Star Wars film in 1977. Ralph McQuarrie was hired to do a lot of the original concept art when George Lucas was pitching it to 20th Century Fox and they were just starting production. But he had done the painting for The Legend of Boggy Creek. That that poster with that sort of lanky, loose-limbed, creature running toward you in silhouette, where all there is the water it's running through and the tree line behind. That's a painting by Ralph McQuarrie. So I wanted to capture some of the primal impact of that Ralph McQuarrie poster. But again, I didn't want to imitate it. Like, I didn't want to just, imitate what McQuarrie had done. So what I did is I played with a couple different approaches to doing Champ. Most images you'll see for books about lake monsters will keep the creature vague. To me, if I ever saw anything like that, and I haven't in my lifetime, but if I ever did, I think I would be riveted by the textures and the details. There's a lot of animals that we are fortunate enough to see living in rural Vermont that are just animals we take for granted. Wild turkeys, red foxes, moose, deer. But when I see an animal in the wild, I'm just riveted by that. And occasionally you'll see an unusual animal in the wild. We had a gray fox that was around the neighborhood for a couple of years. And whenever I would see that, they almost look silver, in the sunlight. And I'm just, that burns into my memory. So I wanted to bring that kind of immediacy, that kind of tactile, that sense of texture and light to a portrait of Champ. And so I chose to do like either a dawn or a twilight, that kind of orangey light that we get in New England skies, right at the beginning of the day or right at the end of the day. And once I had settled on that orange-red color scheme, again, as with deciding on the color scheme for Emily on the cover of the Vermont Ghost Guide, I was going to present Champ with complementary colors, the opposite of the sky and the reflected light on the Lake Champlain waters that Champ is rising out of. My kids are now in their late 30s, but when my kids were little, we used to go walking in the woods a lot, and we would occasionally find shed garter snake skins. You'd come across them in the woods, where it would just be the translucent, freshly shed skin. And whenever we would find that, I would pick them up, bring them back, and put them in a baggie. And I still have them in my drawing studio upstairs. And I took some of that garter snake skin, and I made that part of the painting of Champ. I glued the skin down. I used Elmer's glue. I would glue the skin down, press it under weights, a couple of cement blocks, and leave it to dry in my studio for like 2-3 days so that the glue really dries. And that's some of the scale texture that you're seeing on Champ on that DVD cover art for On the Trail of Champ. And then I went in with watercolor and Dr. Martin dyes. I had to be really careful because the actual snake skin is quite fragile even after you glue it down. I mean, it's a decaying organic matter. So, and I used that to kind of pull out a couple of different color schemes. I wanted to get the feeling of the light, the twilight or the dawn light reflecting on the water, bouncing on the bottom of Champ's underbelly and chin, but have a color scheme that was closer to the true color of his or her scales, being the color that dominates the form as the head and the neck are coming up from the water. So I really tried to do it like a wildlife snapshot, those kind of crystal clear photos that you'll see in Alaskan wildlife magazines, And it worked out pretty well. I was pretty happy with it, and I was overjoyed that both the Breedloves, they're a husband and wife team, they were really happy with the cover art as well. And it was fun. I've only done cover art for like 4 DVD/Blu-ray releases over the years, and that one for On the Trail of Champ is definitely one of my favorites. I still have the original art upstairs, and Now and again, I take it out to check it out. Like the cover for the Vermont Ghost Guide, it was one of those pieces. I don't work digitally. I do everything live on paper with pigment and colors. At any point, that color scheme just could have completely turned to crap, but it didn't. It really worked, and it's cool when you're able to capture kind of a moment in time like that, and work with volatile watercolors and dyes like that, and not have them turn to crap. I'm really happy with it.
I love it, to be honest. Like, before I even realized you made that, I always stared at that poster art even after I watched it from Small Town Monsters, because I was lucky enough to interview Seth Breedlove a few times for some of his films, and he definitely a nice guy, and he works a lot throughout the year.
He does. And part of why I love their work is their documentaries. There's only 2 filmmakers I interviewed for the book that'll be out later this year on the making of The Legend of Boggy Creek. And one of those filmmakers is Seth Breedlove. And the reason I love their work is their films, yes, they're about the monsters or the UFOs, because they also have done 3 documentaries now on UFOs, but they really focus on the people. And that was the power of The Legend of Boggy Creek. The Legend of Boggy Creek is about a region and the people who live there. And I right from their first film, I could see that that's what Seth and Mark Matsky and their creative team focus on, are the people, right? These are things that happen to people. These are things people saw that they didn't want to see. It's nothing these people sought out. It just kind of, they were in the right place at the right time if you're a monster lover, or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time if you're afraid of those things. And Seth and his team with their documentaries, they are terrific movies about a place and people. And I felt that right from the start when I saw their first documentary. And I really felt it when I finally met Seth and Mark and the group. They're just really warm people, and they're attracted to the stories. And that's the same impetus that always drove Joe Citro. Joe Citro always saw what he was doing as a way of sharing an aspect of people's lives, the people that these things happened to, or the people who saw these things. And I feel like that's an honorable tradition, regardless of whether you believe in these things or not. It sort of doesn't matter. It's the stories and the people that matter.
Yes, because I mean, you can even hear in the witness's voice of how traumatized that they became after seeing whatever they saw, or if whatever has happened to them, because they sometimes mention they have been abducted and brought back, or they vanish and then they end up going to a different state and they don't even know how, because last thing they remember is going to bed, like in the woods or something, or even in their own bed, and next thing you know, they're like in California or something, if you ever heard of like that story. But yeah,
yeah.
But I 100% agree with you. Basically, the people is always interesting. Not like the backstories are cool too, but like one of the latest ones I saw was on the trail of what do they call it? The UFOs at night or something like that. I forget exactly. But anyway, that was really clever, and like some of the people that they talked to, even in that documentary, kind of made you go, wow. Like I kind of feel sorry for some of these people because of what they witnessed and what it did to them.
And how it alters their life. I mean, exactly. now and again a story will pop up like the Travis Walton, abduction, where there's, the Hollywood version of the story, Fire from the Sky, is a pretty interesting movie, regardless of the veracity to the actual account of what happened to Travis Walton. The film Fire in the Sky, what it really captures is how traumatic that event was for all the participants. Not just Travis, but his friends who left him, And that movie focuses on the suspicion and the disbelief and the way that it completely turns all those people's lives upside down. Now, I have to stress for you and your listeners, though, my job when I agree, when Seth and his wife asked me to do the cover for On the Trail of Champ, as much as I admire their documentaries and the fact that they're about the people and places, when I'm hired to be the artist, my job is to make Champ as alluring to you as possible. My job is to make the monster, mesmerizing, captivating, alluring. So I have to divorce myself from what my feelings are about the product that I'm doing the cover art from, and I have to put on the hat of the huckster and go, okay, what would sell a documentary about Champ? Well, a really cool painting of Champ, right? so I when I'm working on a cover like that, what I have to think about is how can I get people to pick this up so that they will then watch the documentary and enjoy it for what it is. I'm kind of having to capture the opposite of that, right? How can I put on the cover what isn't in the documentary, which is Champ, right? We've none of us have ever seen a documentary about Champ or Bigfoot or whatever that actually gives you a good look at that creature. Even with the Patterson-Gimlin film, we don't ever get a good look at the creatures, right? They're always like skedaddling away from us or whatever. But my job as the artist is to create a portrait that makes you want to look at it. And if I can make you look at it, you might watch the documentary in the case of On the Trail of Champ. Or in the case of a book like the Vermont Monster Guide, if I can make Champ look cool enough, maybe you'll buy the book and read these stories. So.
And once again, I'll just mention it again, is the color, it's like that bright, like, color pamphlet that you used with On the Trail of Champ, like you did sort of with the Vermont Ghost Guide, where it really catches your eye. It really does. And I think the detail on Champ alone that you did really just boggled your brain of like, oh wow, like look at the detail, but I don't know. I always find it so much better when some people use like the brighter colors, because like you said, it's most of the time when it comes to monsters, we get the scary dark color version, but then when you put it into the light, as I may say, it kind of makes it not so scary.
Well, it also makes it into an animal, right? The Champ on the cover of the Vermont Monster Guide, it's a nighttime setting. We're looking at the lake at night. There's an atmosphere of eeriness. The Champ on the cover of On the Trail of Champ, the feeling I was trying to get is you're on your boat, the sun's coming up, you've been out there fishing since before sunup, and something comes up right next to your boat. And what is it? And I was trying to catch that, and it's a different kind of feeling than the kind of nighttime imagery that most of us traditionally associate with any kind of monster imagery, be it a cryptid or a classic monster like the Wolfman or Dracula or whatever.
Dogman,
it's a whole different feeling. Now, with both covers, though, Paul, I do have a philosophy about covers, and I'll state it very succinctly.
Mm-hmm.
Covers have to catch your eye from across the street, right?
From across the street.
Covers, even before you consciously recognize what you're looking at, should have something about them that pulls you to look at them. And again, this is something I learned, during my years in the video store. Like, it was very educational what kind of cover art on a video box would prompt somebody to go pick it up. Mm-hmm. But, in my own practice, I can name like 2 movies in my life where I crossed the street to look at the movie poster. I was on the other side of the street. The movie theater was across the street. I could not recognize what the poster was, but something about it made me stop, cross the street, and go look at the poster. That is what I try to do with my covers. And now, because people are buying everything online, we are looking at cover art that is shrunk down to the size of your thumbnail. And I've got to come up with something, the image and the color scheme, to make you want to blow up that thumbnail-sized image to see what it is. And I see that as my job when I'm doing the cover art. How can I make this so somebody's going to click on it?
And is that the same way, too, like you do with, like, your other stuff? Like, you still do you still do a hand drawn versus the digital way, obviously. But have you actually tried the digital way at all? I'm just
It
curious.
doesn't interest me. I've played with it. I've got friends, Kat Garza, who I've mentioned a number of times, my good friend Rick Veach, who's a fellow Vermont cartoonist. Rick also worked on Swamp Thing and is doing his own self-published books these days that I highly recommend. They work digitally. It might be the 4-year-old in me, Paul. If I don't leave my studio with ink and paint all over my hands and arms and wrists, I don't feel like I worked.
No, I completely
and part of it is too. I mean, I was mentioning earlier about the difficulty of working in watercolor is you're trying to orchestrate happy accidents. I like working with real world tools because in certain ways I can control them, but I like the accidental aspect of working with real world tools as well. I may have a certain brush stroke in mind when I'm starting a drawing, but my hand may come up with something different, or the ink in the paper may interact in a different way than I'm expecting. And a lot of times that is what excites me to keep drawing. That's the fun of drawing for me. And most digital tools are imitating what real-life analog tools do. I have more fun working, right now anyway, and this is how it's been for me since I was a little kid. I prefer working with the real-world tools. I like the mess. I like the accidents. I like the happy accidents where a drawing or a painting may turn out differently than I had planned in my head, but that is better for me. And that could change as I get older. I may get to a point where just because of the arthritis in my hands, I may not be able to manipulate my brushes and pens with the dexterity and the fluidity that I've enjoyed most of my adult life. At that point, maybe I'll start working digitally. But I don't feel the contact with the paper when I'm working digitally, and I've never been attracted enough to the disconnect between my hand and my eye that digital tools require to learn the skill set necessary to working with digital tools. It's just a bit of my nature. It's a very individual thing. So
no, I support you 100% on what you just said. I mean, like back when I used to have art class in my school, that's basically what I wanted to is like have all the paint, the glue, the whatever I was working with like on me. That way I felt like I did something, And then
on the other hand, though, as a writer, I love the computer. I mean, I look at my old manuscripts of articles I wrote and my first draft books, and carbon paper and cut and paste and typewriter whiteout. Like working as a writer on computers is just like wonderful. I love the freedom that I have as a writer when I'm writing using my laptop or my computer downstairs. But it's also a different mindset. When I'm writing, I'm using a different part of my head, my brain, than I am when I'm drawing. And that may be a factor too. Maybe I spend so much time at the keyboard as a writer. I would say most of my life these days is writing. I just delivered an article this morning, a 4,500 word article this morning, and it was the third article I've delivered to publishers in the last 2 weeks. Maybe it's because I spend so much time at the keyboard that going in the drawing studio is a relief from that, right? So that may be a real key factor as well.
Oh, for sure. And like, it's just amazing of the looking at a cover too, just to kind of give an example between like something that is oil painted or we'll just say painted in general versus something digitally. Like, I think I'll just bring it up again with Vermont Ghost Guide, like just because of the fact of what you say with the fact that it's a watercolor, like not only does it really catch your eye with the colors and the brightness of the colors and stuff, but I think it's also how the texture of the photo or picture really is, right? Like if we were to look at that as a digital, it would be nice and crisp and stuff. But when you look at this one with all the weird texture and like, I guess I don't want to say weird, but I guess it kind of makes sense like weird, but it's almost like it's not crisp. Like it's not like, the lines are straight, the lines are perfect or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a messy artist by nature. I mean, I like drawing from nature. If you look at my body of work, including my comics work, you'll recognize very quickly, this is a guy who doesn't enjoy drawing cars, buildings, machines. This is a guy, me, who loves drawing nature. And nature is messy and organic. The hardest part of painting the cover of the Vermont Ghost Guide was getting that bridge right. Because that's a real bridge that any of us can drive to, right?
Right.
And I had to make sure that covered bridge looked like the real bridge in Stowe Hollow. And I worked from a couple of photographs that my dad took. As an artist, it's important that you work from original source material. Even if it's an actual place, don't just go to Google and pull up the first image that pops up and use that as your reference. For me, it was important to work from actual photographs that someone I know and love, my father, who passed away in 2014, Dad took the pictures, and that's what I worked from. But I had to get that bridge right, and that meant I had to use a ruler, Paul. And I hate drawing with a ruler. I hate doing straight lines, but I had to get the bridge right. But the fun part of painting the bridge was I also had to catch the texture of weathered boards, of old covered bridge. And that was the fun part of doing that part of the painting.
Oh,
the most fun part, which is what I think you're referring to when you're describing, verbally describing the cover art you're seeing there, was the vague sense of just laying down the patterns of autumn leaves. I didn't carefully work out all those trees and all those branches. I just laid down the color to get the feeling of autumn leaves in Vermont. That's a feeling to me. I know what it looks like. We all know what it looks like. But I had to capture the feeling so that as soon as your eye hits it, you go, oh, fall foliage. But that's also the part of the painting, it's vague. It's almost like out of focus because the razor-sharp focus is on the frame around Emily, which is the bridge, and the sharpest focal point on that painting is her face. And if you really look at it, it's pretty vague in and of itself, but I had to make that the focus of the painting. Your eye goes to her, and that's what that entire design was for that cover.
All right. That's beautiful. I love that whole thing there, Steve. So before I let you go, I got two more questions for you. One, you kind of started telling a story for us, so I guess that question is, what are your thoughts on the whole paranormal cryptid stuff of Vermont, or even in general? And you had a story going on anyway about Emily.
Well, the story I started to tell was a group of my friends and I at Johnson State College. I had a circle of very close friends when I went to Johnson State College, which is no longer called Johnson State College. The campus is still there, but I think it's now called it's part of the Northeast College Network or something. But anyway, we all bundled in the car because I had told them about Emily's Bridge. And, you're sitting around at night in the dorm and somebody goes, well, let's go look at it. Do you know where it is? And I'm like, yeah, I can take us right there. I didn't have a car, but Fred Esposito did have a car, so we all pile into Fred's car. And my roommate, Joe Mangelings, was pretty hammered that night. And Joe is a big guy, right? He's from the Boston area, real Massachusetts stock, big, hefty guy. Not fat, like muscle, And so we drive to Emily's Bridge, and it's like midnight or after. We drive out there. And what we didn't know, Paul, was that one of the guys who was part of there was a little tiny fraternity at Johnson State College at the time. Johnson State College in 1975 was a hippie college, right? It was primarily like an alternative education outpost. So there was only one fraternity on campus, and we would have nothing to do with it. We were stoners, and so one of the guys from the frat overheard that we were going to go to Emily's Bridge, and they drove out there before us. We didn't know that at the time, but you need to know this part of the story for the rest of it to work. So we make our way into Stowe, and to get to Emily's Bridge, you have to drive right into the center of the village, and then there's a side street that cuts off. And where we were coming from Johnson, it means as we're coming into the village, we had to turn left, and we're going just out of the village to where Emily's Bridge is. It's not way up in the woods. It's like right, you can walk to it from the village's downtown Stowe. So we pull over, and we're getting out of the car, and Joe, as I said, who's had a few drinks that night, gets out of the car, and I see him before I'm out of the car, kind of hunker down, and he's looking toward the bridge. And on the other side of the bridge is what looks like this white spectral figure standing on the other side of the bridge. And Joe has spotted it first. The rest of us are still getting out of the car. And Joe, I see his whole body tense up. And he hunkers down, and I try to follow his eye line, and I see this white hooded figure off on the other side of the bridge. And Joe runs toward it. His first instinct when he thought he'd seen a ghost wasn't to run away from it. His first instinct was to tackle it. And Joe runs across the bridge and slams into this white figure, and we suddenly hear the voice we recognize as one of the frat guys, whose last name was Lash, go, "Ah!" And they go tumbling over the railing on the other side of the bridge, down toward the brook below. Oh, and no. Joe had tackled the frat guy who was over there with a sheet over him, trying to scare us.
Amazing.
And I still think that is so, people have asked me, what would happen if you saw a ghost? And, my favorite story in the Vermont Ghost Guide, and it's a real story, it's not the one Joe and I made up. I won't tell you which story we made up. But my favorite story in the Vermont Ghost Guide, the first edition, is the story about the guy who's a contractor doing carpentry work on this place, and he looks out the window and he sees a group of sheep and a woman standing with the sheep, like a shepherd. And he hadn't noticed it before, and it strikes him as odd, and he goes over to the front door or the porch of the place he's working on, and there's nothing there. And he goes back inside, and he looks out the window, and there she is again, with her sheep. And he does what I would do. He packed up his tools, and he went home. He got the hell out of there. I still find it hilarious that my good friend Joe Mangelinks' first instinct was, tackle the ghost. I just think that is amazing,
Yeah. Yeah.
And there was a happy ending. Nobody got hurt, even though they went over the railing and fell down toward the brook. Nobody had to go to the hospital or anything. And we were all just cracking up. We couldn't believe it. And as soon as we heard the yell, we recognized who it was Joe had slammed into. And, to this day, Joe's kind of a hero because he tackled the ghost. So it wasn't Emily, though. It wasn't Emily, but
Darn. Well, but yeah. So in general, Steve, do you actually believe there is a paranormal going on in this world? Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I don't know what it is. I have read. I have a massive library, Paul, of books going back to the late 19th century on the subject. It doesn't compare, I'm sure, to Lauren Coleman's library, but it's a pretty healthy library. Yeah, I definitely believe a lot of this stuff is based in people's actual real-world experiences and encounters. I haven't had any. The closest thing I have to a ghost encounter, and it's not anything I can share because it involves another person, and I don't know if they want the story out there, but, I've only had one brush in my life, maybe two, with what people would consider the paranormal. But, like everybody, I've experienced deja vu. I think everybody's had the common experience of deja vu, the feeling of hearing and seeing something for the first time, but they know they've heard or seen it before. And I have talked to people, not anywhere to the point that A folklorist like Joe Citro or a cryptozoologist like Lauren Coleman have talked to people who've had those kind of experience. But I have had conversations with a few people who have had inexplicable experiences with the paranormal, and I find them believable. I believe them. I think there's an aspect of our culture, and it's something that other cultures talk about quite lucidly, as a lot of people in Western civilization look at the world as dead, as inert. It's part of why, as a culture, we have no problem, harvesting oil out of the earth and just seeing property as having a mercantile value rather than a life to it in and of itself. I always grew up with a strong feeling of the outside world, of nature having an innate life force that's very different and very unique. And I'm just kind of wired that way. And so, yeah, I have no problem believing it. I wish I had encountered something, but if I had, Paul, I might not be talking to you today. I might be one of the people that encountered something and didn't want to talk about it.
I know, and that's completely fair. That's a really good, honest answer too. And
there's some people that encounter something and then it becomes a focus of their life to try to track down, what it was. But I do think part of what fires me up to love going into my drawing studio and draw monsters is I've never seen a monster, So it's a pleasurable act for me to exercise my imagination and put those kind of marks on paper so that other people can see the creatures that are in my head. I might not be hardwired that day. If I had experienced something in my real life that was completely inexplicable, I might avoid drawing something like that. So, I am who I am, and I'm thankful for it. I feel blessed. But I have no problem believing that other people have had these encounters. And particularly when we see work like the documentaries by the Small Town Monsters people, and we get to spend a little privileged time with people who have had those kind of encounters, and we can see how it impacts them. We get a glimpse of how it impacts them or change their lives for the better and for the worse, usually for the worse. It's a hard thing to envy. But I also know part of what fuels people like you and Joe is, we want to find out what happened. And as Joe has always said, one-on-one as well when he's speaking to groups, these are just good stories. That's a big part of why Joe Citro does what he does. These are good stories, and he wants to share them. And I also think that's a big part of why people like Seth Breedlove do what they do. In the case of someone like Lauren Coleman, who I do know a bit, I'm not close friends with Lauren, but I met him through Joe Citro, and I've gotten to spend a little time with Lauren, go out for a meal with him and so on. Clearly Lauren is driven by the kind of interest and fascination that I see in my scientist friends, like paleontologists like Dr. Michael Ryan and so on. Lauren wants to find out what this stuff is. And that's more of the impulse that would drive a naturalist or a zoologist. And that's a different impulse than what drives a storyteller.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And Steve, just to finish up the little interview here going on, once again, I appreciate your time, and it's been an honor to talk to you. And, if you ever need an extra voice to help you promote whatever you're working on, that Haunted Vermont related or whatever, please reach out. And speaking of reaching out, so for anybody that is listening, are you still taking requests to maybe help with projects? And I know you're probably busy right now, but if somebody wanted to probably have you be the next artist for their DVD, book, or whatever, how can they reach out to you to network with you?
Well, good question. Thanks for asking it. Right now I'm committed to a number. I just turned 67 yesterday. So I don't know how much time I have left. I have committed.
for
Well,
waiting.
thank you. I have committed to a major nonfiction. I'm sorry. I have committed to a major fiction project, a graphic novel that I'll be working on for the next couple of years. So I'm not looking for work at this point in time. I have committed myself to a collaborative project that I'm very excited about. I can't announce it yet because we literally just signed, and until the publisher announces the project, I'll keep my lip zipped on that. But I'm very excited about it. People can find me on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I don't maintain a regular website, but I'm always doing new work. I'm doing a series of sketchbooks that I'm doing as print on demand with Amazon. So if you Google my name, Stephen R. Bissette, either with the period after the R or without the period after the R, it'll bring you right to my projects that I've done solo, like Brooding Creatures and Thoughtful Creatures. My book, Cryptid Cinema, that I mentioned earlier, which is a book about movies about cryptids or involving cryptids, nonfiction cryptids and fictional cryptids. I also have done a number of collaborative projects. I'll mention Studio of Screams, which I think I referenced right at the beginning of our conversation, Paul, and the Midnight Movie Monograph, David Cronenberg's The Brood. If you're interested in horror films, that's a book I think some of you might enjoy. I do a lot of work with Blu-ray companies these days. I mean, just off the top of my head, I just did the commentary track with my friend G. Michael Dobbs for a new Blu-ray edition of Ralph Bakshi's X-rated animated feature, Fritz the Cat, from 1972. I did the cover art for the 101 Blu-ray release of The Last Broadcast, which is one of the first of the found footage horror movies from 1998. I just delivered commentary tracks for The Return of Count Yorga from 1971, and a couple of Russian fantasy / fairy tale films from the 1950s. They haven't announced the titles yet, so I won't give those titles until they issue them.
We don't want you to get in trouble.
No, and I also got to contribute bonus features I'm really proud of to some box sets. The American Horror Project Volume 2, for those of you Vermont, New England listeners, it features the long-lost Vermont horror film Dark August, and I contributed a video lecture about not just the film, but also sort of a capsule history of Vermont horror films. And there are a number of them, believe it or not. And I also contributed video lectures to a box set from Arrow Films called Cold War Creatures. It's a collection of 4 1950s science fiction monster movies by producer Sam Katzman, and I present the overview of Sam Katzman's career. And I also contributed a video essay to a regional filmmaker package called Weird Wisconsin, the Bill Rebane Collection. And Bill Rebane is a Wisconsin-based independent filmmaker. He's the guy who made the giant spider invasion back in the 1970s. And Arrow Film has put out a collection of, not all, but a number of his features, beautiful brand new transfers. And I did a video essay about Bill Rebane's career and how I experienced those films when they were brand new. Some of them were in theaters, some of them went direct to video. So that's the kind of work I've got out there. And if anyone's interested in finding out about my comics work, DC Comics has released brand new, oversized hardcover editions of the work we did together on Swamp Thing. They're called Absolute Swamp Thing. There's Volume 1 and Volume 2, which are in print right now, and they're about to release Volume 3. These are massive hardcover collections of the work. And if those are too high priced for people, they can also purchase the Swamp Thing collected editions in paperback form, individually by volume, or there's a brand new box set that came out that collects all the Swamp Thing that I did with Alan Moore, John Totleben, and Rick Veitch. So there's a lot of Bissette work out there. And finally, because it's why we're talking to each other, I do want to steer people to the Vermont Ghost Guide, the new edition that people can pick up. is Joseph A. Citro, and the illustrator is Robert Brunel Jr. on the new edition of the Vermont Ghost Guide. And as you and I have been talking about, there is the new edition that just came out last year of the Vermont Monster Guide, and I'm very proud of that. And whether people pick up the old University Press of New England edition or the brand new edition of the Vermont Monster Guide from Erie Lights Publishing, you'll get the same work inside. They're the same book inside. And that's what I got.
Yeah, that's amazing, Steve. I mean, I just can't believe how much like work ethics you have. Like DC, I didn't even know DC was part of your library too. But wow, like that makes me want to go back now and recheck everything. Like even Swamp Thing now. And
hey, Swamp Thing's kind of a cryptid, right? I mean,
that's the way I've always looked at it.
Yeah, so that all feeds into this as well.
Exactly. It's perfect, man. And maybe like I said, maybe if I find something down the road, or maybe something in your mind comes up where you want to talk about it, feel free to contact me again, and we'll talk some more. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me in, Paul, and I hope you and your listeners enjoy the conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And for everybody else, keep your headlights on when you're traveling the road. Do not hike alone. And if you do hike alone, make sure you have like some sort of GPS. And that way, if you get lost in the wood, we can at least find your GPS signal at least. Because we don't want to become like a missing 411 type of thing. Because that stuff gets ridiculous. And just remember to always have fun. Keep your eyes open, because you'll never know if an apparition will appear in front of you.